said that.
Okay.
There was a guarantee that they work.
So we're just going to wait for Kike to kick things off. Yeah. We'll start in a minute. Don't worry. Everyone got really quiet.
Not yet.
Just waiting for him. So thank you all for being here. Kike, would you like to start? Would you like to begin? Yeah, thanks.
So welcome, everyone. My name is Kike Roach, and I am the Unifor Chair in Social Justice and Democracy here at TMU. And we're so pleased to welcome you today to this session. I just want to make a few announcements and just tell you a little bit about Social Justice Week. It's our 12th and our final edition of Social Justice Week, and the idea behind it was always to just bring people together and create community, not just to talk about problems, but also to talk about solutions, what we can do to make our campus, our communities, the world a little bit better. So we're really pleased to be partnering with the School of Journalism, and Sonia Fata and Asma Malik. We're so pleased that you could put this together. The School of Journalism has always been an important part of Social Justice Week, sending people to cover stories and making connections, and we really appreciate all of your participation and support over the years. Just a quick announcement that on September 30th on campus, as you know, it's the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and there's some information about some of the activities that are happening on campus back in that little small table by the corner near the door, and as well these orange shirts. We're asking people to write a message on the shirt. And they're going to be staked around the campus. They're being collected by the Aboriginal Education Council. So if you want to write a message of support, solidarity, change, vision, reflecting on the survivors of the residential school system. And lastly, to my earlier point about wanting to make connections, we think that it's a really critical time for people to get into the habit again of meeting each other and making new connections. You might be sitting in a huge class, but I don't know how many people you've actually spoken to, and whether you've been meeting people from other disciplines across campus. So we're gonna be having a post-Social Justice Week gathering for people who are interested in making change and who are concerned about the student council, the services that you're getting, and wanna see different things happening on campus. So there's a sign-up sheet, again, in that, on that table in the back, for those of you who want to join us for an informal session that's going to happen after the week. Other than that, you can find our whole schedule right on the poster outside the door. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for joining us in person, online, for today's discussion, Solidarity Journalism, Why Social Justice is Newsworthy. We're grateful to be part of this 12th annual Social Justice Week, and this year the event coincides with the National Truth and Reconciliation Week, and the theme is Reclaim, Repair. And it's with this in mind that I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of the harms that journalism has caused, especially here on this land. In their book, Reckoning, Journalism Limits and Possibilities, a book that my class is familiar with, scholars Candace Callison and Mary Lynn Young write, colonialism in Canada and the United States reflects a deep history of dispossession and Indigenous resilience. I know we're going to unpack the multiple edges of that word later in our discussion, where Indigenous people must navigate systemic injustices and discrimination while also arguing for basic needs like clean water, education, and food security. The journalistic record speaks shamefully for itself. Seeing Red, the groundbreaking study of more than 100 years of Canadian newspapers, shows how colonialism has been enforced and stereotypes have been perpetuated by journalists since before Confederation. In the words of our panelist and journalism scholar Anita Varma, solidarity in journalism means journalists stand for human dignity against suffering. The decision to report or not to report leaves neutrality behind. As journalists, we cannot be neutral about systemic injustices, and today's speakers are shifting that paradigm from narrow definitions of news to traditional and new ways of storytelling, and they're centering the communities they most closely serve. I'm also joined here by my TMU colleague, Sonia Fatah. The idea for this panel grew out of our extensive discussions about equity and justice in journalism and was spurred on by our collaborative work looking at the culture of newsrooms in Canada. So I'd like Sonia to introduce herself.
Thank you, Asma. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. The second part of this week's conference is focused on the issue of repair. And repair is a really weighty word, and it's something that many of us in journalism are concerned about, focused on, trying to kind of grapple with. At the School of Journalism, in addition to the work I do with Asma, I also have a live journalism lab which works on trying to develop practices in live journalism, which for those of you who are not familiar is the practice of presenting stories before a live audience. Usually long-form narratives. And some of the things that we are trying to kind of grapple with is what is our responsibility to the communities we cover, and how do we deal with the legacy and the history that Asma has been talking about and that we are trying to engage with in the classroom. So what does it mean to share people's stories, and especially when those stories are coming from a place of discomfort and inequity? And I think we're very lucky here to have a group of people, all of whom are concerned with and considering these questions in their own practice. You will see that we have a series of some of their stories and work that is running on a loop behind us. And what I would like to do before we start is just ask you to introduce yourselves, specifically before, Anita, you share your concept of solidarity journalism. I'd love to pass over to Jacanda, Sean, and Odette to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jaquanda Johnson. I'm based in Flint, Michigan. I'm a founder and a publisher. I founded Flint Beat in 2017. After I got disenchanted with news in general in my community, as a consumer and as a journalist, right? At the time, we were going through the water crisis, so our news was water crisis, crime, and sports. I knew there was more in Flint than just those three things, and so I stepped out there and launched my own media agency, which is now, 5 years later, one of the most trusted news sources in the city of Flint. Later, I partnered with Meta. Now it's Meta, it's no longer Facebook, right? To launch a project called Black Like Us, where I travel the country and I just write restorative narrative. Stories just about Black people defying stereotypes, right? It could be anything, things that we've never seen ourselves do because representation matters. And I just feel like I'm in a special place in this industry to be able to impact and empower people.
My name is Sean Holman. I'm a former investigative journalist, and I'm now the Wayne Crooks Professor of Climate and Environmental Journalism at the University of Victoria. And in that capacity, I'm director of something called the Climate Disaster Project. So the Climate Disaster Project is an international project of 13 universities across Canada and around the world. And what we do is we work with survivors of climate disaster to share their stories of their experiences. And then we take a look at what they are telling us about the common problems they have experienced and the common solutions to those problems. And then we launch investigative and solutions journalism projects around those experiences. So it's a true bottom-up approach to journalism. We're not coming in to cover those communities. We're there to listen and work with those communities. And really, what this project is based on is the fact that we are all climate disaster survivors in some way, shape, or form or another. And yet we don't think of ourselves that way because too often the media has dehumanized the experience of climate change and the lived experience of the people who have experienced it worst and first. So we're trying to work with those communities to help address that as part of a community building exercise at a global scale.
Okay. Hi.
My name is Odette Auger, Dishtakaz, from Duji Segama Kanishnabec through my mom. By my name, it's really obvious my father is French Canadian. And I'm managing editor of Indigenews, and we're based in BC, mostly regional, Okanagan and Vancouver Island, but some national beats also. And I was one of the founding writers in the first year. We came out of an initiative between APTN National News and The Discourse, which is an outlet based in Nanaimo, and that's straight out of the TRC 84 to 86 recommendations. The need for community journalism and more Indigenous writers and increasingly more Indigenous editors. And so I'm happy to return and do that good work with a really powerful team of mostly Indigenous women, all Indigenous women in leadership and flattened hierarchy, which is very modern organizational behavior, but also very deeply culturally satisfying and makes a lot of sense to us on a lot of levels. And so I'm here to speak to you about some of what we do, which is just by nature and by default going to be solidarity journalism.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great segue into Anita. Thank you for being here. Thank you all for being here. If you'd like to start, that'd be great.
Splendid. Thank you all for being here. My name is Anita Varma, and I lead the Solidarity Journalism Initiative. And Asma and Sonia asked me to kick things off with a few framing remarks. So if you notice my introduction is a little bit longer, that is a scripted decision, not a sign of taking up too much time. But I promise to keep it brief. So yes, I'm very excited to be here today. I'm even more excited that all of you are here today. I have to admit that this is among the first events focused on solidarity journalism that use that terminology and the framework that I developed that I myself did not organize. And I think all of your presence here today is a great testament to how important this topic is and how showing up can make different things possible. So to start things off, I'd like all of us in this room to imagine this scenario. And for some of us, it's not really that imagined. It's something we may have experienced firsthand. But here we go. Imagine that there's a problem in your home. And this problem isn't really unique to your home. It's affecting your neighbors. It's also affecting other people you don't know personally, but their homes are structured similarly to yours. So what is this problem? Maybe it's a problem with heating in the coldest months in Toronto. Or maybe it's a problem like not having clean water in the taps. Maybe it's a problem like mold in the walls that is making it difficult to breathe. This issue is affecting your day-to-day life, of course, and it is not something you can fix on your own. You would certainly wish to, but it's not in your hands. So you, I'm sure, are not a complainer, but you are indeed suffering. And you're hearing from other people who are in the same situation that this is simply not livable, right? This issue remains unresolved, and it's really not sustainable if it stays that way. So here's some good news, maybe. News outlets have taken attention of this issue, and there are multiple journalists from some very well-resourced large news outlets who have decided to report on this problem. This could be great, maybe. So what do? They start by speaking to your property manager, and they speak to your apartment building owner. In this scenario, we all live in an apartment. And then they speak to local government officials. All of these folks so far have said this is kind of an issue, but not really an issue. It affects a handful of people. It's nothing too astonishing. There could be a couple exceptions for whom this is really a problem, but it's truly nothing major. Kind of a non-story is what their quotes suggest. The journalists don't stop there. They also speak to a nonprofit organization, and I've worked in nonprofits. We had some great media training to often say that we are committed to serving the community. How exactly, we would not be so keen to specify. And finally, the journalists speak to a few academics. They had to talk to the academics last because academics respond slowly to email, right? And these academics specialize in research on the issue. They've done lengthy systemic analyses, not of this issue. That's a little too recent to have any academic research about it. But they have their past insight that they're very happy to share with the journalist. So the news coverage goes forward and it's published and circulates on social media based on these sources. And keep in mind, this was not a rushed or haphazard or unusual reporting process. They took the time to speak to people in charge of the building. They took the time to speak to local government officials. They took the time to speak to people who study the issue and some folks in the nonprofit sector. Who did they leave out? You, right? You and anyone like you who is actually experiencing this issue. So you read this news coverage, you watch it, and you feel this deep sense of alienation, frustration, disappointment. This coverage is not accurate, even at the very basic level of describing what the issue is at all, right? So you know this because you are living the problem, and it is affecting you, it's still affecting you, and it's not unique to you. So a few weeks later, this problem persists, it's still unresolved, and a journalist does call you for a follow-up story. Maybe they DM'd you first. And the journalist has one and only question for you. How does this situation make you feel? And you say, I'm happy to discuss how it makes me feel, but I also want to clarify that there's some misunderstanding in the reporting that your news outlet and others are putting out about what the problem actually is. The journalist says, thank you so much, but this story is really focused on feelings, and we have experts to tell us what's going on. So this scenario, as I mentioned, is not a far stretch for some of us in this room and plenty more who are not here today. Solidarity journalism seeks to address this problem, which unfortunately recurs across time, place, era, where the people who know the most about social injustice are systematically excluded from representations of it. This is completely counterintuitive, given that the logic of journalism is supposed to be to go to the people who know, right? To report truthfully. And yet the disproportionate focus, airtime, goes to people with credentials. So many people have argued, continue to argue, will be adding me on Twitter to argue this again today, that journalism veering towards people with credentials is not only understandable, it's really smart. Why? They have credentials for a reason, this argument goes. If someone has a PhD, an official position, a leadership role, well, these are indicators of power, and the underlying assumption is that if you have power, you are someone who needs to be listened to, right? If we want rigorous journalism. My contention, and my work on the Solidarity Journalism Initiative as both an educator and a researcher, is all about demonstrating how solidarity journalism ends up being more accurate than news coverage that is disproportionately focused on officials or disproportionately and often solely focused on emotional trauma and testimonials. So journalism often loses its way in pursuing accurate reporting as their goal, but doing so through routines that mean that if you have a podium, a journalist is very likely to listen and pay attention. If you don't have a podium, but you know about the topic being covered, it can be very difficult to get the attention of many people working in dominant and well-resourced news outlets. So how does Solidarity help address this problem? I am so glad you asked. So let's start by defining what solidarity means. Solidarity, as I define it, is a commitment to social justice that translates into action. A commitment to social justice that translates into action. So let's take this a piece at a time. The phrase social justice has been used and misused in so many ways it would make your head spin. But fundamentally, from a philosophy standpoint, it just means dignity for everyone in a society. It means that everyone's dignity is respected. What is dignity? It is our intrinsic worth. It is not something we earn by getting a college degree. It's not something we qualify for or apply for or prove ourselves to have. It's something that we actually have, all of us, by virtue of being people, right? And yet, while we know that human dignity is inherent, we also know that institutions and people with powerful positions do not inherently respect everyone's dignity equally. So that's where journalism, and specifically solidarity journalism, has a role to play and has played a role in urging and requiring that we understand and report this important truth, that people whose dignity is being denied or disrespected both need better and deserve better. They deserve better not because they're special, not because they're super upstanding, they're the model minority, but because they are people, right? So how have journalists done this? Well, when journalists report in solidarity, it means that the story in that first scenario that we all imagined, that they write about your home or mine, would begin with firsthand observations, with our insights, our needs, our vision for what we need to change. Starting with us is the logic here, and it's an action aligned with recognizing, respecting, and representing our basic dignity by including our knowledge of our own lives and the issues that affect them. So usually when I talk about solidarity journalism, I avoid talking about myself, in part because I think what we really need to do is precisely what I promise is just about to happen, which is to hear from folks who are doing this work on the ground, right? Who are insisting that journalism not remain the worst of the harms that it has wrought. But before I turn things over to our panelists and our discussion, I thought I would take just a couple of minutes to situate myself so you know where I'm coming from in this discussion. So my ancestral home is in a place called Bihar, India. And as you can probably guess from my very American accent, I did not grow up there. I grew up in Pennsylvania. But as many of you probably also know, wherever we are geographically or physically, our ancestral home often is something that we carry with us at all times. Bihar is a place that should be known for its amazing poetry, for being the site of Buddha's enlightenment, for being a place of community, resourcefulness, and joy, and certainly a place of intense intergenerational struggles. And yet, in most settings, and I will say particularly academic settings, if I admit to being from Bihar to people who have seen news coverage of this place, the only response I hear is immediately dehumanizing. So here are just a few examples of real quotes that I've heard when I tell people that my ancestral home is Bihar. Quote number 1, Bihar, really? But you speak so well, not like a Bihari. Second quote, Bihar, oh, okay, so you must be corrupt like everyone from Bihar. Quote number 3, Bihar, now there's a clear reason British colonial rule never should have ended.
Wow.
So these are real quotes, and 0 of these people have ever been to Bihar. So where are they getting this from? Well, in many cases, like many of us, they are experiencing places they have never been to personally, physically, through media narratives, right? And to be clear, media narratives may not have originated all stigmatizing narratives of groups and places, but they certainly have played a role in perpetuating, in amplifying, in conserving this kind of claim. The reality, past and present, of Bihar is much more than the worst and most stigmatizing stereotypes of a place or its people. The same holds for places and people that are geographically much closer to where we are right now. So many dominant media narratives of places like Michigan, Texas, Mississippi are barely a tiny sliver of the reality of these places and the people who constitute them. But in the name of neutrality, journalism has often been resistant to admitting that they have played this role in perpetuating stigma and social injustice. So in closing, the point of solidarity journalism is not at all to ignore or sugarcoat the ongoing struggles that people experience in places as close as Toronto and far away as Bihar, but instead to do it all justice by starting with the sources who know and therefore can speak truth, right? Solidarity journalism unapologetically prioritizes people impacted and holds space for people to speak on their own terms about what is happening, what it means, and how it could change for the better. People are fighting for better even as we speak today, and journalism's ethical obligation is to represent the truth of their fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Talking about using that example and talking about power structures and who gets, whose voices are heard, and whose voices are the headline, whose voices are, are these sound bites, what we hear and form our, our impressions of a place that we've never been to.
Yeah.
is really a very clarifying way of looking at this. So in light of this framework of solidarity journalism, I would love to hear from Jaquanda, Sean, and Odette. What do you see as your responsibilities to your audiences? How do you approach, how do you approach them in terms of, people who share their stories, but also people who you're sharing stories with? Jaquanda, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm always disheartened when we get to a point in the industry and we have to revisit the basic rules of journalism. Like the stuff we learn in J school, right? Like people first. Like that's just something really basic that I learned about 20 years ago. I've been doing this thing for 20 years. And so I always carried that with me in my work. I've yet to have an editor say, oh my God, you led off with the people dealing with the mode issue, right? We often get caught up in numbers, as the internet came and took ad dollars from Newsroom and we're trying to pump out so many stories. I think at one point I worked for a large news agency that I had to write 2.5 stories per day, 4.5 comments per day, and get 299,000 or so page views. That was my goal. And I just personally never felt prey to that. Like, I would be in news meetings and my editor would say, you didn't meet these numbers. I said, but I did reach that 299,000 or more because I write about the people. The people that are impacted by these problems. And so for me, it's been really easy to keep that, even though I do get the pushback, I didn't do the 2.5. I didn't write 30 stories that month. I just remember he said, well, yeah, you can do it that way. Or like this other journalist, that journalist had written 110 stories in 1 month. Just trying to feed the beast, right? And so when I'm dealing with this, and in my newsroom, we're a starter newsroom. And so a lot of journalists come into our space that this may be their first newsroom, right? I just beat it every day. Like, did you talk to the community? Community first. Did you talk to the people? Did you talk to the people that's going through that problem? Did you knock on a door? Did you make a call? Did you do a Facebook post? We have Facebook now. You can just jump into a group of parents and say, hey, I'm covering this issue for Flint Community Schools. Can someone reach out to me? Most of the time they will, right? I never thought that was hard. I never thought that talking to people has been hard or getting their side of the story. Not a day, not a day. It's just keeping up with the expectations mainly from legacy newsrooms and them trying to eat, right? Because they are very top heavy when we talk about salaries. I feel like as a journalist, if you are going into a newsroom and you just keep the heart of the things you learn in J school, and you don't have to make an announcement, you just have to do the work and continuously do the work. And also speak up for that work. I have had to speak up for my stories, and take a stand. I haven't been fired, but I have been demoted for arguing with editors. That's just speaking to my truth. I just never cared about being demoted or never really thought it through when it came to potentially being fired because I'm not being insubordinate, right? I'm still doing the work. But if you just keep these basic fundamentals and remember why you got into this and not get trapped into the corporate nonsense that's not even going to your paycheck, right? We really don't make a lot of money in this. So it's not going to your paycheck. You're not running around here in hot tubs and Rolls Royce and, I think you can do it. I think you can be in this battle here in news and still produce really impactful work that can change communities, and just don't give them that part of yourself. You know, most of my stories, I literally have knocked on doors. Most of my stories, I've embedded myself in community. They know me, I know them, they're looking for me, right? I definitely am not one to telephone report. You'll find there's a lot of reporters just sitting in the newsroom to make a lot of phone calls. I'm not that person. And even today, I don't write for Flint Beat. I have a team now, but I get up in the morning and I drive through the city almost every day. And I just drive, just look. I might stop, meet people, talk, see stories. I can't assign my reporters or even be on the same page with them if I have no idea what's really going on in the city of Flint. And that's how they work. I don't have a problem with solutions journalism. Not one reporter has complained about it. Nobody complains about doing an extra step to talk to a resident or a person. We actually was late on this story because I have a reporter that's adamant on talking to parents with students in the Head Start program, you know, versus just leading with a congressman and his statements about funding. And so I think it's easier than we think it is, but we just have to stick to it. If I didn't ramble and get off topic. So.
That was kick-ass.
Oh, get the heck out of here, Sean.
Odette, would you like to share?
Sure, yeah. Our responsibilities to our readers. To me, that is the biggest would be producing stories, sharing stories that they can recognize themselves in. And so we do that through content that's relevant, but also very specific. What one community wants to chat about is not on the table for their sister nation, 50 miles away. They're not talking about that. And so I think that that's probably the most important thing to us. And how we do that is by listening. A writer can have a really good eye for a story, a really keen sense for what's breaking news, and what's equally or more important would be having a good ear to what the community thinks is important. And I think I learned that early on, working with community co-op radio. We had an initiative where, we sent out people like brainstorm your stories and talk to the community, see what you can learn. And very quickly it became obvious that's not going to work. The community has a different idea of the stories that they want to share, very different, in fact. And so we quickly inverted that process and had a community coordinator for a nation talk to the aunties, talk to the elders, find out, just over tea, what stories are you interested in? And then we had some beautiful stories that came out. And so I hold that as one of my earliest learnings, that it's not a story unless I hear it's a story.
Yeah, I think it's true, our responsibility, of course, is to our audiences. But I think our responsibility should also be set by our audiences as well. And sometimes that means doing journalism that doesn't at all look like what we would consider journalism to be. I'll give you an example. Last year, Climate Disaster Project was contacted by the Stein Valley and Kutmik School in Lytton. Now Lytton, which is in British Columbia, is a community that's been heavily affected by climate change. 90% of the buildings were burned down during a climate change-driven heat wave. And the school contacted us because they wanted support in helping to commemorate that disaster and achieve some closure for that disaster. And so they wanted us to support them in not just the creation of a documentary, but the creation of a time capsule. And so what we proposed to the community is a stone painting ceremony, the history of stone painting in that particular territory. And we suggested 3 stones. The first stone, students would paint something that they loved about their territory. Second stone they painted would be someone or something that helped them over the past 12 months. And the third stone was something that they were looking forward to in the future. So many stones about a possible McDonald's in Lytton. And so the second stone was preserved in the time capsule. So metaphorically, the time capsule, which was buried in a public ceremony, became filled with the memories of all the people who had helped students and community members in Lytton. The first stone, something that they loved about their territory, was shared with someone who they loved. And the third stone is part of a public memorial facing the future. This isn't work that we would necessarily consider to be journalism, but the people of Lytton and the students and teachers at Stein Valley and Cupnick School and the Lytton First Nation believed that this is what they needed. And so we were happy to support that.
Thank you.
I'm going to
Yeah.
move on to a different question, but thanks for that example, because I'm really looking to now situate ourselves in how we actually practice what we're talking about, right? And I want to just locate for my students here who are here from Urban Politics and Society for Journalists. We talk about urban issues and how our approach to urban issues can be informed by an understanding of what's not working rather than what is working. So we look at gaps as a way in which to get into our understanding of housing and education and transit and all of those things that are so critical. You write about Flint and like those kinds of, I mean, when I go to Flint Beat, I see all of this kind of city coverage that is around City Hall, education, all these very critical issues. When we report on these issues from a fundamental human rights perspective, what does that mean in practice? And can you share examples of stories that each of you have done that will demonstrate some of these ideas you're talking about?
I think everything on my platform, no. Everything. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just perhaps an example of a story that was particularly challenging or complex.
I live in a really dysfunctional city. City government is horrible. So most things, if we're dealing with local government, is challenging. They lack any type of accountability. They don't respond to FOIA. But a story I can think of that really got to me, it was this, and I actually wrote it, so it's been a couple years, because I didn't get a team until 2020. So prior to 2020, I was doing everything by myself. It was this young lady on the north side of Flint, and we're still in the height of the water crisis, right? And she was having this bacteria problem in her home. And she's telling me, like, she's dealing with Wayne State University, and they're doing all this testing. She has this guy on speaker, and he's running down this stuff in her home, and she has to wear a mask to go in her home at that time, like some type of professional, like, medical mask with these knobs on it and whatnot, because this bacteria, which was typically found in hospitals. And so she tells me that the health department, they know, they're fully aware of this, and they are going to issue an announcement. They don't issue it, but I do call the health department. And when I call them, they tell me they had no idea what I was talking about. I started writing the story, and I promised the next day they drop a press release about some crap they already knew about. And that was really difficult to me because I already knew that the government had lied, but they had promised to be transparent as we were navigating this water crisis. And it just made it all too real what the residents were going through and getting answers. They still are going through some things, like our pipes still haven't been replaced. We're still in water crisis, just in case y'all didn't know. It's more local churches are stepping up for water and food and things like that. The state really isn't involved anymore. But during that, I still wrote the story, we dropped the story, but it just made me understand just how difficult this was going to be. It just made it so real. and knowing 10, 20 years later, we're probably going to be dealing with this crisis. We're probably going to be dealing with the lack of transparency in this. And we recently had a young lady who won a lawsuit, which is the biggest win in Flint. I know off record how much she won for falsifying blood lead test results in children for no good reason. They didn't have capacity. The county was overwhelmed with work, and they just was making up crap, right? And she kept these documents. She kept a document showing like these real test results and a document with all the crap they fudged, you know? And so just wanting to hold local officials, state officials accountable. We have a whole new mayor now. We've had 2 since the water crisis. New governor, right? And we're still navigating it, and it just doesn't seem that there's an end to it in a way. But we're still trying to cover it the best that we can without doing the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit is, oh, this is a $600 million settlement, but not really breaking down the numbers and showing the impact on community. What does that look like? And also understand my newsroom is a small newsroom, comparing it to, Flint is not a news desert. Let's make that clear. Flint has Advance Local, which owns 8 newspapers in Michigan alone, right? They also own newspapers in New York, Alabama, Ohio. Then we have 3 TV stations, 3 news TV stations, and then some other smaller independent media outlets. But most of that hard work, that impactful work falls back to my team, which we are pretty much funded nonprofits. We get grant funds. We right now have 3 reporters and then myself covering the city, but we still kick ass, for lack of a better phrase there, and compete with the big dogs. And like, I'm a Black woman who launched a news agency covering a city, not just Black people. So we covered elections in Spanish. Right now we're working on building a relationship with the Arab community. To build a relationship with the Latino community, it took me 2 years, you know? And so it's those obstacles, like building these relationships in the community so that they feel comfortable talking about their problems and struggles, and also trying to hold government accountable, knowing that they're full of it and they're lying to you. And what does that look like as we move forward?
Yeah, you know, I'm thinking that you're all talking about building relationships, right? Like the idea of bringing community to the table, which I know Discourse Media, when they had the Scarborough Bureau was doing that, they were bringing people to the table to say, well, what is it that you need to hear? And that's such an interesting idea, right? Like to shift the, you know, as you said, like a top-down, shift the top-down hierarchy. What kinds of stories have come out of that kind of engagement that you didn't think would be a story worth doing, that would have, you know, kind of been in solidarity with the community, so to speak?
I can't think of a story off the top of my head that was an unexpected story. More I'm thinking of stories that came to me in unexpected ways. Like, how about that?
Sure.
You know, I remember one story, something we do really well, or I should say really differently, we feel proud of doing differently, are our systemic racism in policing. And we have more than one story that's been really caught something different that the other news outlets did not, or chose not to, is probably more likely. And so that was a story that came to me. A chief of Homoako Nation, his sister, phoned me up one night. It's a beautiful summer evening, having dinner with my youngest, and she said, hi, we need you to come. Can you please come? I'm speaking for the family. The RCMP have shot and killed a young man. Can you come tomorrow? And of course, like you don't say no to that invitation, and it felt like an honor to even be asked. And they knew other media outlets were going to be there. All the big outlets were there, but they wanted Indigenous to come. And so I went there, and it was very clear from the beginning that everything that I had just learned, as an Indigenous writer, how we do things, were not how others are doing things. Big cameras, expensive cameras, just put right into the face of people's despair, and just without introductions, without respect. And it just became very clear as we followed that story. That was Jared Lowndes was shot and killed by RCMP, and just even speaking about it that honestly, instead of someone died during an interaction, or and then once the police unions get involved, it's more like someone died during an intervention. And so just being able to be blunt with it, and also not get into trouble, no lawsuits for, we might not express it as a murder, even if that's how we would see it or how people are speaking of it. So we have our editors taking care of that end of it when the temptation to type murder enters the story. But what was important in that one is even a year later when 9 families from across Canada, so that's just off the top of my head, Rodney Levi from the East Coast, Regis Kruczynski Paquette from here, and a number of other families, they were all outside the legislature buildings in Victoria. And we had just walked, the families were doing an awareness walk. And so different sections of the highway, I had joined them. And there was a moment where we separate ourselves from myself as a woman and as a mother and as a human and the reporter. And so I marched with them down those streets. And then when we reached the lawn, now I'm entering my journalism. Now I'm doing this. And so I joined the other media outlets, and there's the angle that we're not blocking the view. And when someone's sharing and their heart just breaks afresh, I'm not photographing that moment. I'm crying with them. My camera just drops, and there's a much larger camera beside me, and they're sort of looking at me like, oh, are you related? They're trying to see, are you related? Is there some reason why?
Yeah.
Why you? And it's like, no, that's just having a connection as a human, and just having the respect that I'm still very much listening, and we're together with the audience and with the speakers in this moment. It's hard not to be, but I don't need to photograph that pain. And so I think that those types of stories, and just you hear the feedback right away. You might sense that you have the connection and you're hitting it right. But then right away when the community says, this one, finally, we know his name, and we hear from the family. And that was, for me, that was the biggest compliment, to have our readers sharing that. Yeah, we knew what was happening, but here, Indigenous is actually calling it. This is what it was. And it's a man that they know. It's their uncle. It's the one who made them pancakes in the mornings when mom was getting ready for work. And so I think that how we do these stories and how we listen for when we are invited into those stories just leads to more rapport, more respect, and more stories. And I think that series is probably, if I ask you to check out anything at Indigenous, it's our policing series, and a number of other birth alert series too.
Happy to send a follow-up email after this to everyone who registered with links to these stories as well, for sure.
It's such a great, as I'm hearing you guys talk, and I'm thinking, this is fundamentally like the most local kind of journalism, right? And it is the kind of journalism that has been most butchered in the post-Google, Facebook, Meta reality. And some of the principles you're applying, right, like really building these connections with the community, would have been perhaps in some way kind of no-nos, right? No-nos in traditional journalism, like you don't get involved with this stuff, you don't sit and paint stones, you don't do this kind of stuff because you're supposed to be distanced. You're supposed to be this kind of cold observer of facts and information. Anita, it's a shift. It's a shift in practice, and I think we're seeing more of it happen. In your research, you have done some work looking at San Francisco and the housing. Could you talk a little bit about that project and how that informed the solidarity journalism approach?
Yeah, I'm very happy to talk about that. So as you probably noticed from our opening scenario, I have a deep concern about housing issues. And some of that grows out of the fact that I was living in the Bay Area when that housing crisis really began in earnest in 2014 as cost of living skyrocketed beyond what anyone expected or had seen before. This has unfortunately continued across many cities where an influx of folks working in certain industries may change local dynamics around rental costs. So in 2016, 70 local news outlets in the Bay Area, so that includes San Francisco, Oakland, and what's called the South Bay, San Jose area, they all decided to get together and cover homelessness on the same day. This was very unusual because generally speaking, the Bay Area is competitive to start with, and the news landscape is even more so, where they try to differentiate themselves. But they said, the editors organizing and the folks who wrote for this effort, they said, on this issue, we need to set aside competition. This is too important. We need to place pressure on the city to do something about the situation that is leading to people with multiple jobs having no way to afford housing and having nowhere to go because the city is not providing based on the promises they've made. And so after the day of coverage happened, that was June 29th, 2016, I collected all the stories. Keeping in mind, in 2016, there was much less of a culture of aggregation, so I manually collected all 325 of these stories. And then I did something that I don't think any of their other readers did, which is I read all of them. So there were actually 3 tendencies that came out. So one was solidarity reporting, as I just described it. So this is grounded in something that was happening there and was not unique to the San Francisco Homeless Project. The second, though, was this strand of empathy, of narratives that insist that marginalized people, people who are living unhoused, are just like us. Well, who is the us in that? It is a comparatively privileged group that apparently needs to be convinced that human beings are indeed human. So what were some of these stories? They love their dogs, just like you. They are parents, just like you. They really like this pizza spot in San Francisco, just like you. And that narrative is distinct, right? Because the other thing going along with those narratives was this emphasis on the most exceptional, the most upstanding. I mean, if there was a prize for being a person who lives in a tent, Nick, the homeless guy, would have received it. In a city where everyone complains, the streets are so dirty, he sweeps out of the goodness of his own heart. And so Nick, he's one of the good ones. This is an actual story that was published. And there were many more like it that were about these exceptional individuals. And when I spoke to the journalists who were doing this reporting, what was fascinating to me is that the vast majority of them were speaking the language of solidarity, but they were not very clear on how to implement it in their writing, right? And then the third category were disproportionately focused on folks with podiums. The officials responding to the issue of homelessness, insisting that the numbers are far more manageable than you might think. And in fact, what they weren't mentioning is that they consider it rehousing when they give someone a bus ticket to get out of town, right? The person that takes that bus ticket is very unlikely to receive housing on the other end, and the city admits they're not tracking this, and yet in their own numbers, to the point of getting lost in these numbers sometimes, some news outlets amplified that, you know what, this is a great program that's helping to resolve this. Nothing was being resolved by that. And so those are the 3 core trends. We see a lot of teaching in journalism schools and journalism education that would emphasize definitely monitoring officials, that would emphasize empathy approaches, emotional testimonials in reporting, but very little on the side of the solidarity approach, which was actually about a third of these 325 stories. And what's been fascinating through the Solidarity Journalism Initiative is to see how many cities, how many places in North America, abroad, are already doing this type of reporting. But I think the thing that seems to be resonating the most with journalists is that it provides a name for it. And it's not something that they need to apologize for. Sometimes journalists, understandably, have a really sinking feeling in their stomach when someone says you're biased. Solidarity journalism says, hey, guess what? It is your ethical obligation to be biased in favor of respecting basic human dignity, right? And that, I think, is where this started to resonate beyond the Bay Area. But definitely see that as a moment that other cities have emulated in trying to do these communal projects addressing social injustice, but we still see variation in that. So just because our topic is newsworthy doesn't necessarily mean the way of reporting it will inherently be in solidarity. So that's where the practices start to differentiate.
Thank you. I have one last question before I pass over to Asma. And in favor, just looking at the clock, hoping that we can have quick responses for this one, although it's a long conversation. Language is important. How we connect with each other based on the words we use reflects power, reflects all kinds of realities in terms of engagement. So I know, for example, in my live journalism lab, we don't use the word sources because we think sources is an extractionary word. And so when you use a word like that, how does it impact your relationship with the people whose stories you're telling, right? So we use story sharers instead of sources. Solidarity journalism, the word solidarity is also a word, right? Human rights, there's solutions journalism. And some of us are sometimes interchangeably using language that maybe you're more particular or specific about. So before you respond to it, I just want to get a sense from everyone else. How do you use solutions journalism? And do you see a conflict, or do you see one as being potentially like here's the location of the approach, this is the process-based, and here's the direction, this is the output where we can go towards like building on, what is the, what we were talking about earlier, which is, repairing our relationships. Sean, do you want to go first?
Sure.
He's been
Yeah,
quiet.
I know.
Yeah, no worries. I think it's really interesting. I think solutions journalism, to a certain extent, operates in a very traditional journalistic space. Normatively, what we do as journalists is we provide information so people can make better decisions about the world around them, thereby controlling public and private institutions through our decisions in the voting booth and the checkout line. That's sort of the way in which we're set up. And solutions journalism really appeals to that. Here's the thing that we can do to potentially solve these big problems that society is facing. I would say that solidarity journalism, in addition to all of the wonderful things that it does, operates also at the same time in a slightly expanded space. What I'm thinking about, and this has really been sort of part of the work that the Climate Disaster Project has been doing, is I think journalists really need to grapple with the fact that information as the currency of democracy has been completely devalued in our society. And we can try to shore that up all we want. We can try to put bulwarks around it all we want. But I think the thing that we really need to come to grips with as journalists is that the day of information as a controlling value in our society is done, or at the very least is receding. So if that is true, then what is the responsibility of journalists? And what I believe is that we are going to have, over the next 30 years and over the coming century, an increasing need for control and certainty in what will be an increasingly uncertain and uncontrollable world. And if information cannot provide that control and certainty, then we're going to look for other things. And I think what we're going to look to is community. And those communities can be devastatingly unhealthy as we build walls around the world, privileged, keeping out the less privileged, or they can be healthy communities that are more equitable than the ones we have right now, that are more resilient than the ones we have right now. And I think it is in that project, the community building project, that I think journalism should really be focusing on. over the coming years.
Thank you.
Yeah, Odette, I'd love to share. Solutions journalism. It's interesting. This summer, I've been part of an Indigenous cohort, Journalists for Human Rights, and just learning some of those techniques. And I'm just smiling already. It's an interesting process because it felt very much like a highly structured format. It didn't feel natural, didn't necessarily feel comfortable. I'm just speaking for myself. It seemed mostly in two areas, the data. I love digging into numbers too, if it can support my story with the people first. But the overemphasis, I would say, on tracking. We need a project that's been running 5 years to have like really great numbers. Like, well, more interesting to me might be the solutions that are happening unfolding in real time, and how they have to shift to navigate to suit the needs on the street. And so there's no numbers. So therefore, so many cool things that are happening in communities wouldn't qualify. So I had I had a few pitches that weren't accepted for that one. And so I think the data part is interesting because if I'm interviewing an elder and he tells me about the water levels in his community and how it's changed and how it was in his grandfather's day, or another woman I think of, her information comes from her father, who was raised by his great-grandmother. So we're already going back to 1850, if she's born in 1850. And so her sweeping sense of history is very different than 5 years of data that we can pull from a government website. So I think, for that reason, it seemed quite distinct and different from solidarity journalism for me.
I know, Jaquanda, that's solutions journalism is a core part of what you do, and I'd love to hear what the contours of that are like for Flint Beat.
It is a really big part of what we do. We brag about it because we introduced it in the Flint community and we took the lead with gun violence, which is something that plagues Flint like some other cities. And so that's where we took the initiative. Solutions work in Flint is to empower. Through that empowerment, there's impact and there's change, right? And what we do is just give the community potential answers, things we may be able to do, things we might not be able to do, but we can damn sure try. One area I feel that I'm responsible in is building the equitable community in Flint. Everything I do is to build equity in Flint. And so even through our solutions work, we have had change. You know, I'm part of a gun violence task force right now, and we're working to implement a violence interrupters or a peacekeepers program in the city of Flint, right? We pride ourselves in that. We've written stories, something as small as people speeding throughout the city. Next thing you know, we're writing about it, how people are dying because they're getting run down in the middle of the street. And next thing you know, the city officials are putting in speed humps and monitoring traffic devices, right? That residents can call the city and have them set up. So that's empowerment. Like, how do we monitor this to get you the data in order to make this happen? So it plays a vital role in Flint because most of the news is just reporting. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, versus this is what's going on. This is what your community is doing to, in hopes of fixing this, or this is what another community is doing to fix that problem you're going through that we might be able to do. There's nobody else in Flint doing it, considering all of the issues we have. The high illiteracy rate, right? We're a food desert. The water crisis issues, the violence. And sometimes I'm a little thrown, like, well, you guys want to join this solutions bandwagon here, to make this world a better place? But it is definitely, I think, some of us, we were already doing it. They just happen to package it and brand it up and make it nice and define it so we can all be consistent and have talking points. Like this is it. Oh, that's what I've been doing. And the people at the Solutions Journalism Network, they say it. You may have already been doing this. You may have been thinking about it or been pushing for it. They just packaged it, and I like the package. And so now we have not just our newsroom engaged, like when we talk about community. We've went beyond the newsroom, and now we're working with local foundations, community groups, community leaders, and not like local government per se, in order to make change happen. And so it's very important. My local funders now, they want to fund that type of work, and they want to support that type of work, and be forward thinking about how we look at news.
Can I jump in? I'll be brief, I promise. So first and foremost, I'm a huge fan of the Solutions Journalism Network. If you don't follow them on Twitter, please do. They highlight and amplify such amazing reporting. They also have an entire Solutions Journalism Network tracker where you can see all these stories that they've collected on an ongoing basis. So that's number one. Number two is that I would see some overlap with solidarity journalism, and have had great conversations with folks who work on solutions journalism, both in their formal nonprofit and their partners, and they're in agreement. So I don't think it's just me that sees this overlap, which is when the solutions are coming from within communities, when they're validated by the communities that they are supposedly solving something for, and when the communities are saying we are keen to see this continue and grow. I think that form of solutions journalism and that subset, this term within communities solutions, is not my term. That's something that the Solutions Journalism Network said. They tweeted it, and so I don't know who actually wrote it. But you can search for that. It's a great thread. And I think that's really important, that they view that as a subset of the broader umbrella of solutions journalism. So that's the second piece, which is that not all solutions journalism will necessarily be from within communities, right? As you look at this story tracker, it's a great rabbit hole. I highly encourage it. You'll see that some of the solutions are being validated by, as Odette suggested, some other types of data sets, external data sets, or state-sponsored kinds of data sets, which might have their own flaws, right? So there is some variation on this theme. The place where solidarity journalism opens up some more space is to say, what if nothing is working? Then what do we need? And by we, I mean the people affected by the issue. And finally, I just wanted to say that just as solidarity as a term gets used and misused, the term solutions journalism and supposed implementation of it has also been used and misused. After the Uvalde shooting in Texas, there was some suggestion that there was a solutions discussion around arming teachers. And when I reached out to folks who work in solutions journalism, they said, if it's not been done and there's nothing to indicate that that works, we wouldn't consider that solutions journalism. Similarly, in the San Francisco case, there was a ton of supposed solutions journalism that claimed that these things called navigation centers were a solution to homelessness that should be replicated across countries in the United States. It turns out that 90% of unhoused people who entered navigation centers ended up right back on the street. So this question of who is validating and how do we validate that a solution is working, I think is really, really crucial as we think about what the logics of solidarity might be for ensuring that those solutions absolutely lead to community empowerment, as opposed to allowing folks with podiums to say, nothing to see here, we've solved it.
Yeah. And for our newsroom, good solutions work, it also consists of solidarity work. So you have to go, the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, right? And so if our highest hitting solution stories, they contain that element. We did a 3-part crime analysis in Flint, and it was just breaking down what the mayor thought was the answer, right? Yeah, they did okay, right? It did okay. But when we did the gun violence piece, leading with that mother who had lost her son to gun violence and talking to people who had contributed and now are working to fix that problem, like that story, that's what hit home. That's when we saw the police department putting together a task force to help youth, That's when we saw foundations coming together to say, how do we invest in this and what is the answer? And how do we help decrease this and empower community? Like, what does this look like? And they started bringing community members to the table. And so good solutions work for me in our space, it also consists of solidarity work. Like, you have to talk to the community. You have to go to the people that are dealing with this problem damn near every day. If you don't, you're kind of doing a disservice there.
Definitely. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So why don't we go to audience questions, and then we'll come back to wrap things up. Questions. Just feel free. I think we can hear pretty well in this room. Yes, please stand up. Thank you.
My name is you're probably from store. I'm a new international student from Western Sahara. In the past last years, I used to be some sort of journalist citizen, reporting human rights. My question is in a way with that when it comes to solidarity with journalism, would it not be in a way or another will impact the independency of journalists? That's my question.
So the question, thank you, Mahmoud. The question is, does solidarity work impact the object? Is that what you said? Is the objectivity of journalists? Anyone can jump in.
I do. I can't, oh my goodness, because
We're all on the same page.
because I'm managing reporters, right? And we're in a small community. Like, Flint is less than 100,000 people. I think we're like 88,000 people. Anytime they mention somebody, I'm like, yeah, I know their cousin, you know. But you would think it would, because that's what we were told, but it makes your reporting stronger. Those relationships, the experiences. My public health reporter, his name is Nicholas Chan, he just joined. He has a thing about senior citizens. So he's covered seniors for a time. And he asked me if it was okay if he volunteered in a hospice. But it could kind of be like, well, Nicholas, no, because you sometimes cover public health issues as it pertains to seniors. But no, Nicholas gets to experience that. He gets to embed himself in it. Isn't that what investigative journalism is about? Embedding yourself in a situation. So he gets to see how they're navigating problems right there in real time and write about it. I get it, he's human. And if he's not approaching that story as a person or a human, there's a problem. You know, and I know we were taught, you gotta be a journalist, you gotta be objective, you can't have experiences. I was told later that if a person asks you a question and you don't have an opinion, they shouldn't trust you as a journalist. And so you have to remember that. You're a person. Those experiences can produce some very impactful reporting just because you were willing to open yourself up to that. And keep that in, I don't think it impacts objectivity at all.
Or Sean, yeah, either one.
I'd like to jump in. I think it's a myth. It's just a flat out myth that you can be objective. I think we are being arrogant or pompous if we presume that we are being objective in any given moment, because I just think it's a more sophisticated way to think, to acknowledge that we're humans, we're going to have feelings. We know our readers similarly are going to be attracted to certain approaches, and so we would want to tap into that. I want people to see that I'm listening to them and that we're a human and I'm moved by their story, or I'm, also concerned about the issue, and through that they share more, and then that's how you get away from, just a puff piece or just something that you can knock off in an hour to meet quota. The richer story is what happens when you are connecting, and you can't do that and pretend, that there's some sort of wall of objectivity.
Also, does it matter?
End of the day.
I mean, etymologically, the roots of the modern journalistic obsession with objectivity and being unbiased actually come from wire service culture. So the idea back in the post-war period was if we write something neutral, if we write something unbiased, if we write something objective, then it can be carried in multiple different newspapers, regardless of what their political persuasion was. So it was a financial tool, interestingly enough. So in this current environment where everyone claims they're objective, even if they aren't objective, or everyone claims they're unbiased, even if they're not unbiased, I mean, we really have to critically interrogate why exactly we care about this thing in the first place. And I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't think about that too, but we really have to understand what exactly it is we're trying to protect here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly that there's been an unfortunate and mistaken conflation between journalistic objectivity and truth.
Yeah.
Accuracy, rigor, credibility. If we actually look at reporting that supposedly adhered beautifully, perfectly, 100% stuck to the procedure of objectivity, that reporting turns out to be less accurate than reporting that is reported in solidarity. And I think that distinction is really where the rubber hits the road. Right? If objectivity routines were leading to rigorous and truthful and accurate reporting, I would have very little to say. I would suggest we talk about other things. But given that it does not work, that's why we need routines, practices, approaches that do.
And Canadian journalists, by the way, are particularly bad in this regard, right? We're constantly making the choice of choosing sort of being unbiased or objective over the truth. This is the discussion that happens regularly in Canadian newsrooms.
And this is not unconnected to the work that we're doing, looking at the culture of newsrooms, specifically in Canada, which is who is making these decisions, who's deciding, what's the story, who's giving the resources, and where are they going. I think we can take one last question. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sam, and I just want to say, so I do have a personal passion, really strong personal passion for solutions journalism, and I know that what the main aim here is to give the voiceless a voice, and that's kind of the motto I go by. But I think that there's a lot of been a lot of progressive movements in society in recent years. I'm absolutely loving the wave of progressive movements, but I think, sadly enough, I think there are certain rare occasions that there are limits to this. For example, in some cases, for example, I think in the case of when people from Palestine try to speak out about their issues and try to advocate solidarity, I think that is, and we have an issue here in North America that is not shared in most other parts of the world. That solidarity with that group in particular, when it comes, is somewhat stigmatized, and people of that group and of others in solidarity have been harassed, blackmailed, smeared, libeled, and face all sorts of consequences for simply speaking out, regardless or not they were being discriminatory between to another group. Simply speaking out is censored in a democracy like this, which is outrageous. And I just want to know, I don't know, why does it stop there? Why are some voices censored or blackmailed and libeled, but in a way others are not? Why does progressiveness stop at that issue in terms of journalism on that issue?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, which is about the question that Tarek asks is, why does solidarity stop for some groups, specifically in this case, Palestinians and Palestine? Why is that a block? And I think that some of that's related to when we're talking about systemic barriers within whose voices are heard and whose voices are given value. I would love if you were interested in addressing that. Then anyone here on the panel?
That's a management issue. I mean, I launched my own thing because of that, right? Not being heard, and I don't say voiceless. I just say, they have a voice. The platform's not there for them to be heard, right? And so my job is to build a platform for underserved and marginalized individuals to be heard. And I think that that is a lack of diversity in newsrooms when it comes to upper management, because sometimes you get journalists, they don't want to mute those voices, but when it comes to leadership, that's sometimes it might stop there, right? Sometimes it's a lack of understanding. Like I said, a lack of diversity. They have different goals. My goals as a journalist in a newsroom are completely different than what upper management goals might be. They're looking at these numbers and trying to pay bills, and I'm looking at my impact as a writer. And it's unfortunate, but that's definitely what is happening in a number of newsrooms. Not all newsrooms, but a number of newsrooms. We do have this thing with independent newsrooms, nonprofit newsrooms that are working really hard, I think, to build out platforms so people can be heard, right? It's just not moving as fast as we would like it to, or we're not getting the attention for the work that we're doing because we're not some big newsroom. We're not the New York Times, we're not the Washington Post, right? And so we're fighting for this space on the internet, just like other newsrooms. And so I think as we work in these type of spaces here and bring attention to what's going on in the industry and work to diversify newsrooms. Like, I launched a youth journalism program in Flint because we do not have a journalism program in not one school. And so how do I get people that look like me engaged in the industry and into newsrooms? I have to teach and I have to get them young. And so it's work. It'll happen. I mean, we have the internet. I always tell people, you know, if you have the courage and the strength and the fortitude, nowadays, as a journalist, I spent $40, bought a template, $12 on a domain name, and I launched my thing. It wasn't easy, though. It took a minute. I didn't get funding. I mean, 3 years, no money, trying to put it together, standing on the corner of Facebook Avenue, shaking a cup, you know, but it happened, right? And so I feel like if I can do it, any journalist that wants that to happen, that's ambitious enough, and everybody, it's not for everybody, again. If you don't want to, I get it, but we can, and we can build out those platforms so that those voices that are missing in this can be heard.
I think it's a really important point to make the distinction between what a news organization's goal is versus what journalism and journalists' goals are. Because to your point about the bottom line, I see myself as a survivor of many newsrooms in many ways, whether it's through my cultural experiences in newsrooms or whether it's through the economics of newsrooms and the constant layoffs, the constant cycles, the hierarchies in that sense. We have to make that distinction when we're talking about journalism and what that means. And I think that it's been incredibly valuable to have a discussion that's not about business models and the industry that's dying, which is, I know, something that students are often, when we have guest speakers and that kind of thing, that can be kind of the focus. But it's invaluable to have all of you here engaged in such meaningful work that will continue to have such deep impact. And I really appreciate all of you for being here, coming from far, dealing with traveling in these very strange times. We're deeply appreciative of you being here and very appreciative of actually being able to see people instead of black boxes, which is like the best thing ever. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank, I'd also just like a few quick thank yous. Thank you to Kike Roach and Salman Khan and the Social Justice Week organizers for putting on such a great week of programming that is just so engaging and meaningful. I really appreciate that. And thank you to our chair, Ravi Mohabir, in the School of Journalism for sponsoring this event, and Bill Reynolds, the director of the TMU Journalism Research Center. And a huge thank you to Jacqueline Mika, without whom none of our panelists would be here today. and so she's doing all the work behind the scenes to make things happen. So, and thank you to Brian, who's been great with the web streaming and helping us get all set up. So thank you again. And I hope we can continue this conversation. Sonia and I, for our classes, will be sharing this, but we'll put the links together to the stories for all attendees and be able to send that for anyone who registered via Eventbrite. Thank you so much.